Welcome to Resilience 3, powered by FEI Workforce Resilience, building resilient workforces for more than 40 years. In a lot of ways, we're putting together a puzzle. What happened? What did it mean? How do our brains respond to all of this? And now, just how do we arrive in this world? One of the words we choose is grieving, and we do mean choose. Grieving is not a word we use lightly. So why do we choose it? 3 reasons. First, no matter what the new world looks like to each of us individually, we have all lost something. In What Did It Mean, we talked about some of the small things that we've lost: shaking hands, closeness to other people, smiles, which are hidden behind masks. Small things? No, not so small. But there are many, many losses happening at a much larger scale. Secure employment, health insurance, family gatherings, social events, professional sports, music, film, theater, performing arts of all kinds. To say nothing of the way our working worlds have changed, and might stay that way, as many companies consider making work from home the standard. So what are we grieving? For many of us, we are grieving the loss of an entire way of life. A second reason we choose the word grieving is that grief is a universal experience, an experience at the very core of being human. We all experience loss at some point in our lives. Seldom have so many of us experienced loss to such a great extent all at the same time, and that's not the only difference. Mostly, the process of grief focuses on a single event or change, like the loss of a job or death of a loved one. There has been an enormously tragic amount of that, no question. The losses many of us are facing are so broad, so deep, and unlike most traumatic events that tend to play on short timelines from the start of this, we didn't know how long it would last. And that is one of the most difficult uncertainties we will face: prolonged suffering without a foreseeable end. And the third reason for choosing grief to describe our situation? While there are a lot of differences between what's happened to us in 2020 and the more familiar forms of grief, the fact that grieving is a universal human process means that there are a lot of well-developed tools to help us understand and cope with grief. You may have heard grief described as a 5-stage process: shock and denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Often you'll hear these stages rattled off as if they were some sort of checklist you can use to grade yourself, to track just how your grieving is getting along. That's not how the list was originally intended. Although if you've been paying any attention at all to news and social media, you'll have seen plenty of evidence of the role denial or anger may have played in people's behavior during the pandemic. And as we have mentioned, depression is one of the most worrying impacts of the pandemic. Back in the 1960s, a psychiatrist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was doing significant work with terminally ill patients. She's been recognized as a pioneer of work that has led to things like hospice care and treating death in a dignified, open manner. She wrote a book called On Death and Dying, which was how the Kubler-Ross model, the 5-stage process for understanding grief, came to public awareness. The model was originally used to understand the experience of terminally ill patients. Since then, it has been applied not only to people experiencing loss of any kind, but also as a model for understanding the way people and organizations respond to change. Dr. Kubler-Ross made it clear during her lifetime that she didn't view the 5-stage grieving process as a linear, step-by-step description of everybody's experience of grief. Rather, the 5 stages were more like states that a grieving human being might repeat or jump back and forth between states in any order. There's been a lot of questioning over the years as to whether or not the 5-stage grieving process has any validity or is useful at all. We're not here to solve that question, but what we do find interesting is what leads us from grieving to processing and arriving in our new world. Later in her career, Dr. Kubler-Ross decided to expand her model. Over the years, others have contributed as well. While you often see the model with its original 5 stages, you can also find stages added between depression and acceptance. The upward turn, testing, reconstruction and working through. We'll come back to these 3 stages in a minute. For now, let's take a few moments to talk about the stages of grief in a pandemic. And let's just recall the original 5 stages: shock and denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. If we take a moment to consider the way these 5 stages played out in 2020, we can begin to understand why grieving our losses is so difficult. Okay, we'll start with shock and denial. Shock, plenty of that. our social structure, our working environments, perhaps our employment and financial stability, and the health or even lives of ourselves and our loved ones, all threatened starting in early 2020. Shock? Definitely. But what about denial? You might be used to hearing about denial as a negative thing. Maybe our own refusal or inability to recognize our circumstances or emotions. In the context of grieving, denial is viewed as a positive response until it isn't. A buffer, a circuit breaker for feelings, a way to keep us from being overwhelmed in the earliest stages of a traumatic event. In a pandemic, however, as unpredictable as denial might seem, it can be very harmful if it leads to unsafe behaviors or habits. After all, a virus, any virus, doesn't require your belief in it to be dangerous. Anger? We have certainly seen anger during 2020 everywhere. Mainstream media, social media, and in the very streets of our hometowns. Much of the unrest has been directed at long-standing social inequities that must be addressed if we are ever going to achieve an equitable society. It's worth noting, though, that this unrest did happen in the midst of great fear and uncertainty building as the pandemic continued with no end in sight. Our entire culture has been pushed into a fight, flight, or freeze response. The anger over all we have lost has saturated us, and what we know about the brain's response to long-term stress is that it diminishes our ability to control our stronger emotions. Anger? Definitely, and at a time when we are least able to choose a healthier response. It would be easy enough to dismiss bargaining as an exercise in wishful but pointless thinking. After all, we can't negotiate with a virus any more than we can with any other illness. There's more to bargaining than that. Bargaining is a way for us to begin acclimating ourselves to the new reality waiting for us. We'll accept this new world if only what? The purpose of the bargain is the process, the connecting the world we knew with a new world waiting for us. The wrinkle in 2020 is that we must hope that our bargains don't lead us into unsafe choices. Which brings us to depression. Public health experts the world over spoke frequently and continue to speak about the risk posed by the circumstances of 2020 and how those risks go far beyond the symptoms or outcomes of the virus. Depression and all the suffering that can result is a real threat, and this time, that threat stands for all of us. Now, we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't remind you to ask of yourself a few questions. Are you feeling low, or useless, or like a failure? Have you lost interest in pleasurable things? Has there been a change in your appetite? Are you having trouble sleeping or sleeping a lot more? Are you having trouble concentrating? If your answer to any of these questions is yes, and if one or more of these things has been going on for a week or more, you may be dealing with depression at a clinical level. We'd encourage you to get some help. Talk to a healthcare professional. We've included some links to more information in this course, and we will remind you that your employee assistance program exists for moments like this. Please don't hesitate. This is a time for us to set aside any stigma we may harbor around mental and emotional illness. The things we are talking about, the problems and losses we are facing, are happening to one degree or another to all of us. Depression is very real, and so are the challenges we face as we make this transition. Which brings us to the last of the original 5 stages of grief, acceptance. Just like the other stages, our situation here is unique. To be certain, we need to accept that our old way of life is gone. Unfortunately, being able to accept a loss very much depends on some idea of what comes next. And we don't know what's next, or how long next will take to get here. For our part, we think about some good advice we heard at the beginning of all this. Don't work to get back to the world that was. Work to make the new world better. Which brings us to those 3 additional stages: the upward turn, testing, reconstruction, and working through. We'd like to think of these as the processing, which along with grieving will allow us to arrive and flourish in our new world. The upward turn. This will be different for everybody. You may see it as a small sign of some sort, maybe a change for the better in your mood. Pay attention to these things. Build on the positives that come your way. But don't rely on random chance to produce a change for the better. Your intentionally positive thoughts and actions can produce the moment of change. Be your own good fortune. Testing. It will be up to each of us to understand this new world of work. We can't reproduce the world we had. We have to replace it. We can't do that all at once. We'll need to work a small piece at a time to create new habits. Baby steps. Understand new ways of interacting, new ways of being professional and social. Reconstruction and working through. This is the real work in front of us. The impacts of the pandemic will be felt across our society for many years to come. Without knowing how or when the pandemic will resolve, there's no way to even guess what those impacts will be. Raising the question, how do we reconstruct and work through when all we have in front of us is uncertainty? We do that by being aware we are facing uncertainty and that it causes us fear, anxiety, and a sense of loss. Those feelings may not be comfortable. Think of them as your brain's not so subtle reminder to yourself that things have changed and that you have to respond. Grieve. Process. Arrive. It is a process. It will have a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is our basis for hope, that there is a new world and we are in it. Let us accept but not linger on what we have lost, and then be grateful for what we have. To learn more, visit learning.resilience3.com.